Hi guys, this is chapter 9 of Pasquala. It's called A Time of Sadness. Late one evening, the padre came to tell my mother that my father and the other neophytes had returned from Santa Barbara. The padre told her that the men had returned very tired and sick. The padre had taken them to the infirmary, the sick room, and he told us we could not visit my father until morning. When the first pink light of day brightened the sky, my mother and I went to the infirmary to see my father. The padre would not let us go into the sick room. He told us that the men were very ill and we could see them from the doorway. As I peered into the darkened room, I could hear coughing and smell the strong scent of the tea that the padre brought to the sick men. Father was lying on a cot close to the door, a blanket tucked loosely around him. He was very quiet. Later that morning, when my mother and I returned to the infirmary and looked through the doorway, we could see my father tossing and turning on his cot. His face, neck, and arms were covered with red rash. While we stood at the door, a woman who was helping the padre care for the sick men told us that my father was very ill. Hearing our voices, my father opened his eyes and looked at us. When the woman left the room to get more water, father told us in a shaky voice that he was going to die. He asked us to leave the mission and return to the Valley of the Tules. Before we could speak to him, the woman returned and told us to leave the sick room. As we walked out of the infirmary and down the corridor, tears filled our eyes. We knew that father was dying. 5 nights later, my father died. My mother and I were sad and afraid. A few days after my father's death, 3 of the neophytes who had traveled to Santa Barbara with my father died. Fear spread throughout the mission. Although the padre worked day and night to care for the sick people, more and more neophytes became ill and died. Many of the workers in the shop stopped working. Mother and I knew that it was time to do what my father had told us. We had to leave the mission. The next morning, when the mission bells called us to prayers, Mother told me that we were going to leave the mission and return to our valley. When the people at the mission went to the chapel, my mother gathered a few of our belongings, and together we started off through the mountain passes to our home in the Valley of the Tules. We walked together in silence, thinking about my father. What would become of us? Would the Yokuts welcome us back to our village? The journey seemed long and slow. We followed a trail that I had never traveled before. Mother told me it was an old trail she had known as a child. It was longer but easier with a few high mountains to cross. Along the trail, we picked berries and drank water from the mountain streams. At night, we looked for shelter in caves or slept under a tree. As the trail came closer to the valley, we could feel the warmth of the air that was rising from the hot valley floor. Several days later, we reached our village and went to my uncle's kawi. Mother told my uncle that my father had died at the mission. She said we had come home to the Valley of the Tules. My uncle did not say a word. He sat very still, staring at us. My mother then tried to explain why we had gone to the mission. She said that my father had talked about returning to our village, but he knew he had disgraced his people. His feelings had kept him from returning to the Valley of the Tules. His last wish before he died was for us to come home where we belonged. When my mother finished talking, there was a long silence, and then my uncle spoke. He told mother and me that our family should have come back to the village long ago. My uncle's voice was stern when he told us the mission way of life was not our way of life. He said that by not returning to our village, we had weakened the spirit of our tribe. We were not living as our ancestors had taught us. My uncle told us that he was unhappy with us and that we must never again leave our valley. That night, as I lay on my tule mat in my uncle's kawi, I thought about the death of my father. I began to cry softly. I could hear my mother crying too. I knew she cried not only for the loss of my father, but for the sorrow that we had caused our people.